Salams from the People's Dispatch Studios in New Delhi. I'm Siddhantani, and debriefing us today on your show, Daily Debrief, is Prashant Radhakrishnan. We're talking about Donald Trump today, we're talking about Palestine, and we're talking climate change. We begin with the ongoing investigation into the January 6th riot, where an extreme right-wing mob invaded the Capitol building in Washington, D.C., the seat of the US Congress. Shortly before this invasion, then US President Donald Trump had addressed this very mob. In the aftermath of the incident, a probe was launched to find out who was responsible. On Tuesday, a federal judge denied former President Donald Trump's request to block documents from being handed over to a House committee investigating the riots. US District Judge Tanya Shutkan said the records, which are held by the National Archives of the US, can be released to the probe panel. Prashant, what's this investigation all about?
So, Siddhant, the images on January 6th were, they were beamed across the world, and they really marked a key point in America's history. I mean, I say it in a very particular manner because it was a right-wing mob. It was a right-wing mob which invaded the Capitol building, which is the seat of the US government. The houses of Congress are there. And it is a mob which was actually encouraged by Trump. Trump had just before spoken to them, told them to stop the steal, take action. By stop the steal, what he meant was to stop the steal of the election which he had lost. It was very clear. So the attempt of this mob was actually to block the certification of the results of the election, of the November elections, which Joe Biden had clearly won. Multiple courts had said that he had won. Republicans had said that he had won. Everyone had accepted it, but Trump refused it, and Trump and his associates refused it. So, they invaded the Congress buildings, they entered senators' offices, vandalized various parts. Lawmakers were forced to flee in terror, and about 7 people died, including immediately in the aftermath of the incident as well, including some Trump supporters, some police personnel as well. But I mean, the real blow was to America's democracy, or what democracy in quotes. We talked about why it's democracy in quotes many times, but that's really the issue. So this panel has been slowly working towards finding and identifying what this was. And one of the key aspects to remember is that this is not just one mob and one speech that we're talking about. We're talking about a concerted strategy over months to deny the results of the elections. So around the same time, there was something called a war room in a restaurant where a lot of Trump associates were working in various ways to try to stop the certification of the results. Right. So, some people were trying to convince the vice president, some others, some congresspersons, some others trying to mobilize support. So the panel has recently called some of these people for investigation, as in some of the people who were part of this war room.
Right.
So what we see right now is basically that there's been a very slow and steady progress towards trying to have some kind of accountability. Over 700 people have been charged for that riot. I don't know if there have been so many convictions per se, but this is a small step. Now, the larger question, of course, is that whether lessons will be learned from this, whether there will be actual accountability. Now, we know that Trump is accountable, Trump is responsible. There's no question of that. But the point is, will they be able to pin it down in a legal sense? Or will there be any convictions? Big question. It's very uncertain as of now, because there'll always be loopholes where Trump can say that I was saying stop the steal, but that doesn't mean I didn't say go and riot. And that's probably what many of his associates are going to say as well. And which has been the general Republican narrative after that. The fact that they say that, the rioters should not have done that, but Trump was justified in questioning the results. Whereas that's really a problem. The fact that despite a very closely certified process, nonetheless, Trump was able to challenge it. He was able to convince a lot of people that the elections were stolen or rigged, this huge mass of conspiracy theories. So that's really the impact or target. That's really the wound that America's democratic system, so to speak, has sustained. And that is the one difficult to recover from. So irrespective of whether this probe commission itself is able to do a lot, that larger question still remains, that how does the country recover from a sitting president challenging an election and are encouraging their supporters to riot. Now, this is, from an international perspective, this is especially ironic because the United States is happy to challenge elections in every other part of the world where none of this has happened. Where there are no protests, like Nicaragua. Recently, Biden released a statement saying it was a farce of an election. So it really begs the question that, considering your own recent history, is this really the question you need to be asking?
And in fact, the foundation on which the whole world order is based.
Exactly. Right. And that's really been the US. So the hypocrisies of the US position really stand out all the more when incidents like this happen. The fact that Trump did not want these documents to go to the probe itself shows,
something.
so again, as I said, these happen everywhere, but in the US, it's all the more egregious when it happens because the position the administration, the country takes with respect to other countries.
Yeah.
And like I said, the larger question really here is that, irrespective of what the probe panel concludes, whether they'll be able to actually bring about any proper accountability is a large question, because this is at so many levels that this has been happening. There have been instances, for instance, of various electoral authorities across the country being threatened by right-wing supporters of Trump. Those who, for instance, endorsed or certified results. Many of them, those who are working at polling booths. So many people are now scared to work in polling stations because of the threat, of the fear that right-wing right-wing people might threaten them. There have been actually documented cases where the police have had to intervene. So all in all, a very bleak situation for America's electoral democracy at various levels. So this is, of course, the topmost level we're talking about. But when you have a local teacher or a government employee who's scared of going to work at a polling booth, that shows the extent of the rot.
So if we're having this conversation, I'm assuming that similar conversations are happening across the US as well. What sort of impact has that had on Trump and his sort of position in American society in popularity?
Right, Siddhant, that's important because you see, especially during the Trump years and after the Trump years, what we have seen is a Republican Party which has, for lack of a better word, gone rogue. Both parties were rogue in always as far as the rest of the world was concerned, but the Republican Party, especially now internally, is more rogue than it used to be.
Right.
So we have seen sections of the Republican Party, for instance, double down in their support of Trump. People who, and Trump himself has, time and again threatened, for instance, to go against more moderate candidates. Recently, the Virginia governor's election was an example where, the Republican candidate finally won, but he had to thread this thin line between having the right distance from Trump has become a big question for Republicans right now. So there remains a substantial chunk of the Republican support base which is very, very heavily pro-Trump, despite the fact that he's, his record in office is there for all of us to see. And it's not only people in the US, but people in Iran, people in Cuba who have suffered because of him. But nonetheless, there is a strong section of the Republican base which really swears by Trump still, which is definitely prepared to back him if he contests again in 2024. And this is also having an impact on the party in other parts of the state, because even those who are not necessarily pro-Trump have to deal with the possibility that his supporters could spoil their electoral bid in various ways. And like we talked about before on the show, the Republican Party now is so to the right, so extremist, that it matches with some of the most extreme right-wing political parties in Europe. So there's this whole category of very, very extreme racist, probably racist right-wing parties, or at least for whom racism is one of the foundational concepts.
For sure.
And at least sections of the Republicans have now unfortunately have entered that realm. So, like I said, there is no real huge decline in support for Trump. Even those who technically may not be pro-Trump so much, nonetheless have to deal with him and his supporters. So I don't think there's been this rejection of Trump and Trumpism as many people had speculated after the elections. People thought that, okay, Trump is defeated now, it'll be back to business as usual, where the Republicans and Democrats can together run corporate interests or be a front for corporate interests, which is what a lot of US politics is. But that has not happened. So in fact, there has been speculation that, will we see a Trump 2.0, where a candidate who is maybe who's more disciplined, but who has exactly the same politics, comes to the fore of the Republican Party. So Trump and Trumpism definitely here to stay in one form or the other for quite some time. And it is not going to be easy at all to remove or take away that impact. And I think that way the politics of the United States is, at least it's at particular levels, has shifted far to the right. Now, on the other hand, it's good to note that there has been a lot of, especially at the grassroots level, there have been a number of progressive victories about politics, about candidates. That's been great. But at the same time, there has been a crystallization to some extent of the Republican support base also. So that's actually a very worrying trend. And also, the important thing to note here is that the Democrats do not know how to address many of Trump's supporters.
Right.
So you get this sense that the Democrats have basically given up on a large category of people. And those people, they're like, okay, that's a Trump supporter, nothing doing. Whereas the question really is that politics is the art of addressing your opponent's supporters as well.
Right.
So the Democrats don't have a solution for that, because they increasingly are coming across as just a party which is wedded to the interests of, the big business and big corporates. And so What we're seeing is that kind of a schism which is very difficult to bridge. And so we need to see how it will pan out in the future as well.
Yeah, and important ramifications for the rest of the world, like you pointed out.
Absolutely.
Of course. So we'll keep a close watch on our friends in the US, of course, as
Right.
we always do. But we move on now to Palestine. On October 22nd, as we reported before on the show, Israel designated 6 prominent civil society and human rights groups as terrorist organizations. Some of these organizations do critical work documenting the lives and struggles of the Palestinian people, provide legal aid, and coordinate activities with international organizations such as the United Nations and the ICC. The designation was widely condemned by the international community and rights groups as unjustified and baseless. It's an escalation of Israel's efforts, of course, to silence Palestinian civil society as much as possible. A short while ago, my partner in crime, Prashant, spoke with Raja Shahade, the founder of Al-Haq, one of the organizations that has been described as terrorist.
Thank you so much for joining us. So, first of all, I wanted to ask you about the context in which this declaration has been made. We know that, of course, many organizations in the recent past have been targeted in various ways. Palestinian organizations, Palestinian activists there have been crackdowns, many have been detained, put in administrative detention, for example. But this declaration of 6 organizations, some of which are very prominent, many of which have a long record of working not only in the country, but with international groups as well. That was seen as a surprise by many people. So does this really mark an escalation as far as Israel's actions are concerned?
Absolutely. In fact, I have expected that Al-Haq would be beset by all kinds of harassments, but never expected that it will come to the point when it will be declared, designated as a terrorist organization. This is extreme and unpredicted. Of course, over the years, the organization has had many difficulties. So, for example, when we established it in 1979, Israel said that it was but a cover up for the PLO. The PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, was then a proscribed organization, a legal organization. And then it said it was a cover for other organizations that were also proscribed. And when we made our first book on exposing Israel's actions in the law, in passing laws that are intended to increase the settlements and annex the lands and take over the land and so on, they answered us with a book of their own. So the level of the communication then was much different. And then in 2002, when Israel invaded the West Bank, they trashed and attacked and destroyed so many NGOs and official offices in the Palestinian Authority, but did not come at all to Al-Haq and stayed away from our offices. So over the years, although there was harassment, although there was arrests of the field workers, and the present director, who was then a field worker, Sha'wan Jabarin, was detained and tortured heavily over the years, and yet still the organization was never closed. And so this comes as a total surprise and a shock that it is declared a terrorist organization of all things.
All right, now it's back to Glasgow for our ongoing coverage of COP26, the climate summit. Our colleague Zoe is on the ground there. She's been in the thick of the action, covering the response and demands of people's movements around COP26. People's movements have been extremely critical of the poor response shown by world leaders and the fact that there has only been largely symbolic action so far, considering, of course, the massive extent of the problem, and it's one that the entire world faces. Let's listen in to what Zoe has to say.
I'm here on the streets of Glasgow, where the COP26 meeting has been taking place for the last 2 weeks. It is about to come to a close. It's been an interesting 2 weeks, really full of protests, full of different meetings that have been occurring on the sidelines of the COP26 negotiations. Sadly, many people have been somewhat discouraged by the negotiations that have been taking place inside. A lot of the key promises that people have highlighted, going into this summit, to be able to really tackle head on the challenges in front of us in terms of climate change, such as reducing emissions to the previous targets that were set, net zero for the global north countries, initiatives to keep the global warming below, not reach the 1.5 degrees Celsius. Similarly, even with, climate funding, the rich nations contributing the $100 million a year to developing nations and poor countries to be able to, tackle the pressing needs they have amid this climate crisis. Of course, necessary to highlight that there are, many nations that are already suffering very adverse effects from climate change. Islands that are disappearing, mass migration because of climate catastrophes. And so, these were some of the key elements going into these negotiations, and these countries have really not addressed them at all. And then, other things that weren't even on the table, such as demilitarization. Important to note that the U.S. military is one of the largest contributors to not only greenhouse gas emissions, but, direct environmental devastation, with their 800 plus military bases across the world, the entire military industrial complex of the United States, and not only the U.S., but also the UK, other EU nations, enormous contributors, and the military, once again, not really mentioned in any of the negotiations, not even mentioned within the calculations of their emissions. So there's a huge, gap. There's a huge lacking when we're talking about, their contribution and the necessary methods to really get out of this climate crisis. So, these are some of the really big gaps, but thankfully people's movements, different left and communist organizations, trade unions, environmental organizations have been on the sidelines of this official summit and have organized numerous activities. On the 7th, there was a Global Day of Action, and then since then there has been, massive panel discussions, actions, rallies, other sorts of events to really highlight these issues which are missing, the issues of the frontline communities, the issues of who are the real contributors, talking about the oil and gas executives who have been inside of these negotiations, participating and getting their voices heard, but really when the voices of the communities, of the people who are resisting climate change, are not being heard. So this has been a really crucial summit. We've seen very, very interesting discussions of way forward. A lot of people highlighting that it is not possible to really achieve the necessary changes needed to stop climate change within the system of capitalism. This is definitely the consensus that people are coming to, where, there's not necessarily consensus among the environmental movements that what is the way forward, but people are, already in agreement that capitalism is not the solution. And this is a huge step forward from the past where people weren't naming the problem specifically, when it was a little vague, not able to identify this. So I think a lot of people on the left have seen a lot of inspiration and are looking very positively towards these developments. And, from now, a lot of people have said, this COP26 official negotiation summit did not, of course, bring the necessary and important changes that were promised. And that, from the People's Summit, from the summit of the movements, of the trade unions, this is the beginning or the continuation of a long time struggle that will continue in the territories, that will continue in the halls of parliament across the world to demand that these rich countries, for example, contribute to the climate fund, that they tell their multinational corporations to get out of these developing countries and stop extracting their resources so the people do not have a climate and do not, cannot use these resources for their own. So I think it's been an important couple of weeks in Glasgow, but not for the reasons that people, expected necessarily from these world leaders. So we'll see what happens going forward. And it has been a really, inspiring time to be here with the People's Summit and hearing from these people.
And finally, staying on the subject of climate change, there's been a lot of speeches, a lot of, what we were saying the other day, a lot of talky. One particular speech has gone viral. The foreign minister of Tuvalu, Simon Kofe, spoke to delegates not from a fancy platform or a dais in a well-decorated room, but knee-deep in seawater, dressed in a suit. Kofi was demonstrating the vulnerability of his country and many other island nations, of course, to climate change. This nation, the nation of Tuvalu, is located halfway between Hawaii and Australia. Prashant, this picture, I mean, it says it all.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. Right. I mean, you really can't say much beyond this, except the fact, for instance, that Tuvalu is an especially depressing case. Fourth smallest country in the world, 9 islands, 2 of which I believe are deeply under threat. It's a very small country, and the impact of climate change has been massive. People of Tuvalu have been talking about this for decades now, because something as simple as the fact that their fish are getting poisoned, or they're not able to raise crops anymore. People are falling ill, and there's nothing that people can do, because it's not that you leave one place in your country and you go to another place. You can't do that, because the entire country, all the 9 islands, are at risk of being submerged. Now, scientists are saying that within 50 to 100 years, Tuvalu could disappear. And that, I think, is there's no greater indictment or no greater example of how the entire world has failed on this issue than an example like this. Because just imagine what happens that in about 50 to 60 years, entire countries disappear. And this is happening across the world. Tuvalu is in the Pacific, of course, but parts of Bangladesh could face the same situation. Or in Latin America or in the United States, there are regions which could be submerged. And some countries, of course, might have resources to take care of their populations. But I don't think what happens when Tuvalu stops existing is really the question. Where do its people go? Its people end up being refugees, people without a homeland. They need to struggle for citizenship. Who's going to take care of all this? And if you see what's happening with refugees now, you know how they're treated across the world. So I think those are heartbreaking questions that are really difficult to think about, because, say, 100 years down the line, if humanity is still around, hopefully it is. These are questions that these subjects, these incidents in history are things our children are probably going to challenge us about. Are going to ask us questions about it. Where were you when
all this was going on?
Tuvalu is drowning. I think that's the catch-all, that term that they use across the continent. Tuvalu is drowning. And where were you when Tuvalu is drowning is really the question that our children will ask not only their leaders, but it's a question to the generations past also. So I think COP26, like we said, a lot of discussion, a lot of numbers. It's difficult understanding many of these numbers, what is the impact. But this is concrete impact. The idea that within a few decades, an entire country disappears. That's a horrifying thought.
Right, so a slightly humorous photograph there, but definitely sending across a very clear message that this is no laughing matter at all. And that'll do it for us on the show today. From Prashant and myself, you've been watching Daily Debrief, presented by People's Dispatch. You can follow us on all the regular social media channels and visit our website, peoplesdispatch.org. We'll see you again, same time, same place tomorrow. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.